Again, Mozart did once write a piano sonata that was structurally a bit off the wall, the so-called Alla Turca Sonata, K331. But he then went about his business as if this had never happened, writing sonatas that followed the classical paradigm precisely. For Beethoven, by contrast, Opus 26 proves to be just the beginning. In fact, he immediately ups the ante with the two sonatas, Opus 27. Even the name of these works breaks ground. Each is called Sonata quasi una fantasia. Now, the notion of fantasy and sonata united is not entirely new, but in the past, the idea was to present them as distinct works in a sequence, their opposed natures being the very point of the exercise. Mozart, for example, wrote a fantasy and sonata in C minor. There's no hard evidence that he intended them to be played together, but they certainly seem like a perfect fit, and many generations of pianists have programmed them that way. But again, the success of the idea comes from the searching, free-form, constantly unsettled fantasy giving way, almost resolving even, to an extremely structured sonata. It surely isn't an accident that the first movement of the sonata, which naturally follows directly on the heels of the fantasy, is really quite square in its phrase structure. It is highly dramatic music, but mainly because of the character of its themes. The construction of the movement is highly regular, answering the questions that the fantasy poses. It is chaos making way for order. So, to have a work that is simultaneously fantasy and a sonata surely seemed like a contradiction in terms. The title makes really a bold statement, which Beethoven has clearly been leading up to with Opus 26, that something other than sonata form and the standard succession of movements can be the glue that holds a sonata together. Again, this notion had an enormous impact on 19th century composers. The Schumann Fantasy, one of the really greatest piano works of the Romantic generation, was originally titled Grand Sonata. And indeed, given the way that it takes large-scale forms and injects an amazing degree of freedom and harmonic instability into them, one could make an equally strong case for either title. And what was Schumann's motivation in writing the fantasy? It was to raise money to build a statue of who else? Beethoven. The Schumann is a particularly useful example, but Mendelssohn also wrote a work which is sometimes known as fantasy, other times as the Scottish Sonata. In fact, the list goes on and on. And with Beethoven's Opus 27 sonatas, it really isn't simply a question of a new title. In form and in atmosphere, these pieces are utterly unlike anything Beethoven had ever written, or really like anything he would write subsequently. They're also notably unlike one another. The man really didn't ever run out of ideas. The first of the two sonatas is like Opus 26 in that none of its movements are in sonata form. While the works are very different, that in itself is significant. After 13 sonatas that each begin with a sonata allegro, now he's over 2. It serves as confirmation that he really is going in a new direction. But the real innovation in Opus 27, number 1, is that there are no breaks between the movements. Now, the Variations first movement of Opus 26 was nearly without precedent, and many features of it would have certainly raised Mozart's eyebrows. But this is really unheard of. And Beethoven uses other techniques to further blur the boundaries between the movements. The first movement itself is interrupted in the middle by an unrelated idea in a drastically faster tempo. This is the first time that Beethoven writes a single sonata movement in more than one tempo, excluding works with slow introductions, which is another story entirely. The third movement doesn't resolve. It finishes on a trill on the dominant, a half cadence that needs the last movement to resolve it. And just at the moment that the exuberant last movement seems headed for its climax, it stops, again unresolved, and launches into an extended quotation, a callback, I'd say, to the inward third movement. This is doubly significant because the last movement was already somehow the weightiest of the four. With the addition of the quotation, it acquires a gravity which the rest of the piece doesn't have. And so the rebalancing of the Beethoven sonata continues with this work. But back to my original point. Even without the literal linking of the movements, there are plenty of things in this piece which confuse the listener as to where one ends and another begins. Add to that the lack of space between movements, and you see that this is a work which not only helps redefine the role of each movement within the sonata, it suggests that the movements themselves cannot be truly separated out. That is a radical notion. To me, Opus 27, number 1, does feel more unified than Opus 26, and not only because there's no silence in it to disturb the unity, there is a sense of inevitability in the way the movements follow one another. Whatever character is missing from one movement is invariably the central one in the next. So the grace of the first movement is answered by the fidgetiness of the second, is answered by the inwardness of the third, and so on. But while the work is amazingly daring, and I would not call it unsuccessful by any means, there is still a bit of self-consciousness in the experimentation. One perceives it as, if not really a capital A idea, at least an experiment. And indeed, he never returned to it. No subsequent sonata links all of the movements. As Beethoven goes along, he finds less literal but ultimately more meaningful ways of uniting the movements of his sonatas. Still, this is really a marvelous piece, and since unfortunately I'm not going to play it because we have a limitation of time, I really highly recommend that you give it a listen on your own time. Let's take a short break for a review question.